Good morning. And a very warm welcome on this very cold day to the 35th annual Marion Thompson Wright Lecture Series, Curating Black America. My name is Mark Krasovic. I'm the Associate Director of the Institute on Ethnicity, Culture, and the Modern Experience. And I know I speak for all of my colleagues at the Institute when I say that we are delighted to have you all here at Rutgers University-Newark to celebrate this Black History Month. And we especially thank our honored guest speakers who traveled up and down the Northeast Corridor to be with us today. We gather as we do every third Saturday in February in the spirit of intellectual and civic fellowship to honor the past, to learn from it, and to honor too those who made the history and those who research it, write it, and this year those who curate it. We gather this year also with no small amount of sorrow, for it is the first time we gather without Professor Clement A. Price, our guiding light, mentor, teacher, colleague, and always friend. In 1981, he and the late Giles R. Wright, the director of the Afro-American History Program at the New Jersey Historical Commission, started the lecture series in honor of Black History Month, running it, as Dr. Price often said, from the trunks of their cars. And 34 years later, we run it out of our very own building at 49 Bleecker Street. And so I ask now that we join together in a moment of silence, as Clement would say, a real moment of silence, in remembrance of those now lost to us who over several decades built Marion Thompson Wright into the annual civic ritual that brings us back together in ever-increasing numbers year after year. Over the past few months, I've been thinking about how one might sum up Dr. Price's, maybe you'd call it his ethic, the core belief that drove his work. And no doubt each one of us would come up with something different. On a different day, I might say something different. But this is what it is to me today. He believed that there was a large public audience for the best, the most rigorous, the most creative work in the arts and humanities, an audience of lifelong learners of all races and ages, genders and sexualities, from every walk of life, from every corner of Newark, every corner of the nation, every corner of the world. And he believed that the arts and that academic scholarship were at their best when they reached out to that ready audience and made themselves useful. The history of MTW, the speakers who join us this year and every year, and your presence here today in such large numbers with such warmth, enthusiasm, these demonstrate that he was right. So I say once again, welcome, and thank you for being here. And now, there's no better way to honor Dr. Price, Giles Wright's work, and I know that they would have it no other way than by getting on with the program, as they established and nurtured it over many years. So as we do, I ask, now we're getting down to nuts and bolts, that you please silence your cell phones, but keep them close at hand, connect with us on social media, tweet MTW, Instagram it, whatever you do. This year's program is presented, as it is every year, by the Institute on Ethnicity, Culture, and the Modern Experience at Rutgers University-Newark, and the Federated Department of History at Rutgers University-Newark and the New Jersey Institute of Technology. We offer warm thanks to all of our funders and partners whose generosity, year after year, now in many cases decade after decade, make MTW possible. Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, the Office of the Chancellor, Rutgers University-Newark, the Prudential Foundation, the New Jersey Historical Commission, the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, the Rutgers Committee to Advance Our Common Purposes, and of course, the Newark Museum. These are long-standing supporters and advocates of the lecture series, and we are deeply grateful for their friendship. Funding for public programs in the arts and humanities is very often dependent on our ability to demonstrate the value of those programs to this broad community of learners. We have been able to do that because of your thoughtfulness every year in filling out the surveys that you will find in your program. We ask that you please do so again today as completely as you can. Your answers are incredibly important to us, and you can drop them off when you're ready at the registration table outside these doors. And finally, we sometimes do this at the end of the day, but I think I'd like to do it near the beginning. I want to recognize and express my deepest gratitude to 4 people in particular whose expertise, care, and hard work make MTW possible. You've probably already met them out at the registration table, or you've received email blasts from them or read their Facebook and Twitter posts, but you may not know their names or faces. And actually, I don't even know if they're in the room right now because they may be putting out some fires that I would rather not know about. But track them down sometime today and say hello. In any case, thank you a million times over to the Institute staff, Senior Program Coordinator Marisa Pearson, Laura Triano, sitting at the corner, our newest member, Afton Baldwin, and from the History Department, the Department Administrator, Christina Strasburger, who's out there. Without them, MTW just does not happen. And I say that, I know that Clem Price would say that. Thank you. So here's how today will work. It's a little bit different, slightly different than in past years. We'll have our morning session, break for lunch, and reconvene for our afternoon speakers according to our regular schedule. And afterward, as we do every year, we'll head over to the Newark Museum for a reception, free food, free live music. And at that reception, a special tribute to Dr. Clement Price begins with special presentations and a few special announcements from Rutgers University President Robert L. Barchi. That will begin at about 4 o'clock. Then at about 5 o'clock, there will be a public discussion of Dr. Price's work and legacy among some of the greatest laborers in the fields of the public arts and humanities. That will also be at the museum in the Billy Johnson Auditorium. So please come for the food, for the music, and to hear from Spencer Crew, Nell Irvin Painter, Janetta Cole, Taylor Branch, and Annette Gordon-Reed. So please, stick around. All right, we begin our program proper as we do every year with music. We've been so fortunate year after year to have such wonderful instrumentalists and vocalists open our program, and this year is no exception. Months and months ago, we reached out to our good friend Susan Stucker, who I know is here today. Thank you, Susan. The chief operating officer at the New Jersey Symphony Orchestra, our neighbors just across Military Park, and asked who might open this year's program. And Susan introduced us to, and we are honored to have with us today, Brennan Sweet, violinist and associate concertmaster with the New Jersey Symphony Orchestra. We will hear first, as is our tradition, the Negro National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. Then Brennan will play one more selection after that. So please join me in welcoming Brennan Sweet. I'm sorry to say that because needs and schedules change, two of our regular dignitaries who would otherwise be with us this morning are not able to join us, but they will be here later in the day. So I mentioned before, Rutgers University President Robert Barchi will be joining us at the reception, and Lieutenant Governor Kim Guadagno will be here this afternoon to say a few words. But we're honored this morning, as we are every year, by the presence of several others. The first of these, among many other things, was recently a Gustav Henningberg Civic Fellow at the Institute. Every few years, the Institute convenes a class of Henningberg Civic Fellows, typically a small group of civic leaders who come to campus every few weeks to meet with each other and with Rutgers faculty to discuss various challenges and opportunities and to explore ways to meet those challenges and make the most of those opportunities. And so about 2 years ago, Dr. Price had this idea, and it sounded a little crazy to a lot of people. But he insisted it would work. He had this idea to invite the 4 candidates then running for mayor in Newark to be the core of the class of the 2013 Henningberg Fellows. His idea was that maybe the conversations they would have with faculty members, with a host of special guests that we invited, and with each other, that maybe those conversations would help elevate the campaign and enrich the work of the incoming administration. And so, long story short, and from where I sat, it was great. It worked. And one of the key reasons that it worked was because of Ras Baraka's regular participation. This is not a political speech, I'm just saying this is true. In the midst of the campaign, then Councilman Baraka, attended every meeting of the fellows and attended not just in body, but in mind and spirit, as a thoughtful speaker and a deep listener. So we are very happy to have him back at an Institute program, not his first MTW, I'm sure. So please join me in welcoming Mayor Ras Baraka.
Good morning. I wish I could see you. But it's an extreme pleasure to be here this morning at the lecture series that Dr. Clem Price put together, named after someone, I think, of his own heart, people who had Newark in their fabric, in their mind, in their soul, in their studies, who believed that our lives and trip in and through the city of Newark was relevant, was important, was powerful. And today, this room being filled as it is today speaks to the kind of impact that I think both of them have and had, and particularly Dr. Price, on the intellectual community in the city of Newark and around the city of Newark, but also the social community in this city as well. The title, Curating Black History, is also befitting because we are trying to harmonize or put something together where we take pieces of our history and show the community and show the world and study it. It reminds me of W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the first scholars of this country who used empirical data studying the Philadelphia Negro. That kind of study was made useful. He didn't just study it in an academic way. He studied it so that we can use it and so that we can change people's conditions. And I think that this lecture series and what Dr. Price was trying to do was get us to think about our relationship to this country, to this world, to each other in this city, and to change it, not just to look at it, not just to observe it, not just to marvel at its beauty, at its tragedy, but to actually think about it in a way that we can do something about the condition that surrounds us every single day, right? And I'm not going to say much more, but I was moved by the Lift Every Voice and Sing rendition, but it's the Black National Anthem, brother, not the Negro National Anthem. But I was moved by the rendition because it means something to me in my heart. It makes me think of the kind of terrible path, terrible and beautiful at the same time path that we have ventured on, moving from slavery to civil rights, to freedom, to where we are today, being able to have this lecture in Paul Robeson Center at Rutgers University, where Paul Robeson was once not recognized by this institution. So we get to celebrate Clem Price, Marion Thompson, Paul Robeson, and curate Black history in 2015 with the first African-American president of the United States of America in this building in the city of Newark, with the son of Amiri Baraka being the mayor of the city. If you don't go to church on Sunday, today is church, because God is most certainly good. To make all of these things interlock and intersect at this time period in history is for a purpose. Our job, maybe today, when we're listening to the speakers, is to figure out what our individual purpose in this time is. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Last year, I had the great pleasure of welcoming Rutgers University-Newark Chancellor Nancy Cantor to her first MTW, about, I think, 5 or 6 weeks after her term had officially begun. And at that time, I spoke about the buzz of excitement and energy that accompanied her landing here in Newark. And a year later, that buzz can still be heard. And it's been joined by the sound of a vibrant campus-wide discussion of the university's future, a discussion that has already produced not only a strategic plan that is both a wonderful combination of exciting and achievable, but also a string of deeply creative, deeply thoughtful, and deeply engaged new university projects. And I think you can learn about at least one of them, Cherry Blossoms in Winter, spearheaded by my friend and colleague Fran Bartkowski. I think there's some literature out at the registration table on that. And if you haven't heard about others, you will soon. The Newest Americans, led by my friend Tim Raphael. The Queer Newark Oral History Project, led by a bunch of people, many of whom are in this room, but projects that reflect a renewed investment in the public mission of our university. In short, Chancellor Cantor's profound commitment to this type of work has been contagious. And I should add, on a note closer to home, I want to thank her on behalf of all of us at the Institute for her great support of us as people and as an institute over the past few rather difficult months. Shortly after Dr. Price's passing, she came to us, gave 1,000 hugs. She comes from the Clem Price School of Hugging, which I think the motto of which is often. And she said, "I want you to know that the Institute and the work you do will continue." And now that seems really obvious, but at the time it was exactly what we needed to hear. So please join me in welcoming Chancellor Nancy Cantor back to her second and what I hope will be a long string of MTW.
Thank you, Mark. And I do think for sure Clem would want us to pause and give an applause for Mark. So as we all gather and recognize this 35th Marion Thompson Wright lecture, we take a long, deep breath, for it's a moment of memory, a memorial for Clem, and for what it has meant to have this remarkable series. A series of lived and living history that will live on, as will dear Clem, and his legacy. For lives like his and that of Marion Thompson Wright, and like those that are curated by and in this series, and in the museums and parks and historic sites preserved and presented and created by those who will speak here today, do not pass on. They inspire always for all time. Clem and Marion Thompson Wright were both historians who demonstrated day in and day out that real lives matter. Black lives matter in history and in real life. And they worked at that very intersection between history and real life, reminding us neither to romanticize the past nor to forget its stamp on the present and what it can tell us about pushing on. And in my mind, that is what Curating Black America is all about. Not to glorify, but not to forget. And to keep attempting to realize more possibilities. There were many victories that Marion Thompson Wright didn't get to see for herself in the civil rights struggles of her time, and yet her handwriting was on them for all to see. Clem isn't here for this 35th, yet his mark is all over it. Thus, in a year when we feel the hole left in our souls by Clem's passing, it is so right that this year's theme is Curating Black America. For curating is at once about the past and always about now and the future. It fills our souls with images and icons, stories and voices that once lived or live now for real or an imaginative reality, and then always live on by the very act of curation. It is a tribute, a reflection, a celebration, a questioning, a critique, a call to action, and most of all, it's a hopeful act itself. Curation, when done well, as all our remarkable speakers today so exemplify, is perplexing because its impact depends so pointedly on being at once invitingly inclusive and bravely selective. And nothing is more deserving of that perfect intertwining than the Black experience, the history, the art, the lives that define an exceptional struggle that itself defines all of America's. Or as Lonnie Bunch said about his grand project, and I quote, "The notion that is so important here is that African American culture is used as a lens to understand what it means to be an American. How prophetically necessary is that as a reminder to us all in a time when it seems that images so often are designed to distance and protect white America, whoever that really is, from Black America, reified and simplified to signal the other. While I certainly didn't know Marion Thompson Wright, I suspect that, like Clem, a fitting descriptor of what she and he both stood for is vigilant hope, and that curating Black America represents that same spirit of agency. Certainly not sentimental or simple hope, rather vigilant hope, precisely informed by how long it takes and how hard it is to realize the apparently simple, but not so immediately gained, basic rights of being seen. Seen as fully valuable, fully human, fully real, seen as just as fully human as the onlooker. When we collectively curate Black America, joining as those appreciative onlookers with those here today, Lonnie Bunch, Robert Stanton, Thelma Golden, George McDaniel, Katherine Braxton, Rebecca Campbell, and of course, Clement A. Price and Marion Thompson Wright, whose care and courage realize its inspiring potential. We ask only, not simply, but that it be seen in full view and understood with full humanity. Today, even as we celebrate with such exhilarating expectation the opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and Lonnie knows well how Clement Alexander Price will be looking down on its glorious achievement with equal parts of love and critique, we are reminded of what Clem knew so well. Everyday life in everyday communities curates, for better or worse, injustice and in injustice, the lives of Black America. As pictures of Selma and Montgomery curate one period, the pictures of Ferguson and Staten Island curate another. We have marched, and there is much more marching left to do for democracy to reign true to its principles. Thank you, Clem.
That's Nancy Cantor. And finally, I'd like to welcome to the podium someone who needs no introduction to this community of learners, of people who love the arts and humanities, and who know the best of those worlds can be found right here in Newark. We all know Mary Sue Sweeney Price as someone who, as director of the Newark Museum, played an outsized role in building that Newark, a city of the arts, of the sciences, of the humanities. And we at the Institute and at Rutgers University-Newark broadly just know her as family. She has helped us over the years, and very recently with everything from the design of our MTW posters to plotting a sustainable future for the Institute's work. So we thank her, we adore her, and it is with great pleasure that I welcome Mary Sue Price to the podium.
Thank you, Mark, Mayor Baraka, Nancy, and Brennan Sweet. How much Clement loved your music always. As you've heard, Clement called today a public ritual. Truly, it is the synthesis and probably the apotheosis of all that he believed in. Informed public history, national and international in scope, bringing together on one singular day for an enormous joint intellectual inquiry the vast array of people from every walk of life, academia, public service, the arts and humanities, education, the streets, the vast array of people whom Clement knew and loved to celebrate Black history. What Clement was a race man. He absolutely was a 21st century race man. So over the past 3 months, so many of you have come up to me to say, thank you for sharing him, as if that were an option. Nor would I have ever wanted it to be. When you shared a lingering meal, a bear hug, participated in a meeting he seemingly effortlessly guided, engaged in a personal chat, an uproarious phone call, or sent him an email, one of the 57,000 in his inbox, I do not kid, Clement was truly your best friend, and probably the best friend of every person in this room. But as a wise woman who knew Clement probably longer than most of us observed last week, no one really realizes the hard work that went on behind that public life. And so it is my honor and privilege today to introduce those who provided Clement with what he called his safe harbor, his family. If you read his seminal essay, The Path to Big Mama's House, and that's what it was really called long before the movie series, The Path to Big Mama's House, Historic Preservation, Memory, and African American History, all about Lillian White Spann, his wonderful grandmother. You know the foundational, spiritually generative importance of the Spann and Price families in forming the values that guided Clement's life. And so joining us today are Clement's brother, James Leo Price Jr., and wife Betty Spells Price, sister Jamila Price Gaines and husband Donald Gaines, his Price nephews, his Spann, Bell, and Kennedy cousins, and his many beloved godsons and their parents. Will you all stand and be recognized? In closing, I thank again Mark Krasovic, Marisa Pearson, the entire Institute staff for so valiantly carrying on. It was difficult for us all. Nancy Cantor, Marcia Brown, and the entire Rutgers family for enfolding our family during these difficult months. MT lecturer and dear friend Lonnie Bunch, and all of today's speakers who will address the central tenet of Clement's professional life, public history, and the African American experience. And finally, all of you who have so generously contributed to the endowments that will continue his life and work. Thank you so much.
Curating Black America. In planning for this entry in the Marion Thompson Wright Lecture Series, we were very opportunistic. We wanted to mark the imminent opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., by exploring the ways the Black experience, the history, the art, the lives, is remembered and presented to a diverse global audience. And we want to emphasize, as we have with previous entries in the series, the challenges and opportunities inherent in curation and memory, especially now as the newest resident of the mall readies to spotlight such issues for the world. And we also wanted to continue with a more recent MTW theme. The past two entries really emphasized work. Last year's Tending the Light on community organizing, and the previous year's Emancipation and the Work of Freedom. So at a time when it seems the word curation is sometimes cheapened by its overuse in the marketplace, the wine club whose selection has been curated, the high-end shoe store that does not just stock and sell sneakers, but curates them, or the tablet that comes preloaded with curated apps for you. We wanted to call attention to the deeply considered, deeply intellectual work of curating as a profession. In museums and historic sites where curation is no doubt about creating unique visitor experiences, but is also run through with concerns for accuracy, for complexity, for justice. So while some of the core ideas are familiar, the actual process of choosing the specific theme and the people who we would ask to speak to it was the quickest, most painless process of pulling together an MTW in my, albeit relatively brief, experience here. We were all sitting, staff meeting in Dr. Price's office. Once we had the theme, he came up with the title. He turned to his computer and click, click, "Dear Lonnie, would you do us the great honor of being our 2015 Marion Thompson Wright Lecturer? The theme will be Curating Black America, and the event will take place on February 21st, 2015. And no kidding, in about 10 minutes, he had a reply. "Dear Clem, I would be honored." And we were off. And now here we are, must be 14, 15 months later, and it is my great pleasure to introduce this year's Marion Thompson Wright Lecturer. Dr. Lonnie Bunch is the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Smithsonian Institution. Born in Newark, raised in Belleville, Dr. Bunch is no stranger to this city, to this university, and to the Institute. I couldn't possibly recount all the numerous occasions he's been here for various programs, speaking to various audiences, meeting with various classes on campus, including at several prior MTWs. But I do know that one of his most recent visits was in May of 2013 when he received an honorary doctorate from Rutgers University-Newark and served as our distinguished commencement speaker. And anyone who saw him that day will know that they have much to look forward to today. He will speak on the challenge of building a national museum. It is always an honor and a great joy to have him here in Newark. Please join me in welcoming this year's Marion Thompson Wright Lecturer, Lonnie Bunch.
Thank you so much for those kind words. I have to be honest, normally when I come home, I'm extremely happy. But like all of us here today, I'm bittersweet today. In part because when Clem asked me to talk about the challenge of building a national museum, I didn't realize that the biggest challenge was going to be how to do it without him. Because in many ways, Clem Price is at the heart of what a national museum is and what we wanted to do. Clem was one of the people that served as part of our scholarly advisory committee, and it was Clem's goodwill, creativity, and smarts that helped us move through many difficult decisions about what we should interpret and how we should tell that story. So for me, the challenge is to sort of make sure that I always have Clem on my shoulder as we move forward. But one of the joys for me was that Spencer Crew, Clem, and I got a chance to put together a 3-volume history looking at the slave narratives that came out while Clem was alive. And it was so wonderful for us because we've been friends for 30 years, but the three of us had never written together. It was a really wonderful moment. But what is more powerful is that the book has been so well received that we've been asked by the publisher to do a 1-volume version called Memories of the Enslaved. And though Clem wasn't able to participate as much as we want, he is obviously one of the authors. The book will be dedicated to him, but most importantly, any and all royalties of the book will be given to the Institute. And I gotta be honest, it might not be much, but my mother will buy 5 copies, I know. I can hear Clem and Giles saying, "Come on, Lonnie, get going." Okay, so let me do that. Early in my career at the Smithsonian, I was asked to curate an exhibition on the 19th century. And one part of it wanted to look at the story of enslavement. I wanted to find one plantation to focus on. So I traveled around the country. I looked at sugar plantations in Louisiana. I wrestled with cotton plantations in Alabama. I looked at tobacco plantations in North Carolina. And then I was taken to an amazing rice plantation, the old Friendfield plantation on the Waccamaw Neck above Georgetown, South Carolina. And when I drove down the road, there extant were 15 slave cabins from the 1850s. And next to one of those cabins was a man in his 90s named Mr. Johnson. And Mr. Johnson had lived in one of those cabins with his enslaved grandmother. So you could imagine, for a historian, this is the Holy Grail. Somebody that could tell you what this was like. And Mr. Johnson was amazing. He took me to the front of the cabin, and he talked about how his enslaved ancestors took a broom and did a hard sweep to make the ground hard as concrete so there'd be no grass or no vermin. He took me to one side and he talked for 40 minutes about the role children played, watching the chimney, making sure it didn't catch fire or fall down. We went to the back of the cabin and he talked about the crops that his grandmother and the enslaved population grew to supplement what they were given. And then we went to the fourth side, or rather I went to the fourth side. Mr. Johnson didn't come. And I said, Mr. Johnson, what's happening over here? He said, boy, I'm not going over there. I said, Mr. Johnson, please, I've come all the way from DC, help me out. And he said, I'm not going over there because there's nothing but rattlesnakes over there. Being somebody from Newark, after I stopped running, I asked him, I said, Mr. Johnson, why didn't you tell me? He said, son, people used to remember, now they forget. And if you're a historian, your job is to help people remember, but remember not just what they want, but what they need. And in many ways, the challenge to help America remember not just what it wants, but what it needs, by creating a national museum on the Mall, has been a 100-year struggle. This idea began in 1913. Many of you may remember that 1913 was the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. And there are amazing photographs of old Yankees and old rebels shaking hands, saying the war is over. But you don't see any black people in those pictures, even though thousands of African Americans participated in the war. So many of those descendants decided they were going to build a national museum on the Mall. They actually got legislation, discussions, money was raised, and then kind of World War I happened, no museum. The idea gets picked up again in the 1920s by Calvin Coolidge. Now, how often do you say that name, right? But Calvin Coolidge actually had legislation passed to build a museum. The Depression hits, bad timing. The idea lies fallow until the 80s and 90s when Mickey Leland and Congressman John Lewis begin to raise this idea, but they can't get it through. It doesn't pass until 2003. And it passes then only for several reasons. First of all, you had over 50 years of brilliant scholarship, some created by the people in this room, that is really at the heart of what any national museum could be. But you also had a realization that the leadership, that the participants in the civil rights movement were fading from the scene. And it was a desire to remember, to capture their stories. But also, quite honestly, it passed because for the first time, it had bipartisan support. Think about the people that sponsored the legislation. Congressman John Lewis, we all know and love. Senator Sam Brownback. So that in many ways, I'll let you go where you want to go with that, but in many ways, it meant that for the first time, Republicans and Democrats could support something. And then the legislation is passed and signed by George W. Bush. But the challenge really was, first of all, to figure out what is a vision for this museum? What should an African-American museum on the Mall be in the 21st century? Well, part of that was easy. Part of it was keeping Mr. Johnson's words in mind, to create a place that allowed us all to remember the Martin Luther Kings and the Sojourner Truths and the Ella Bakers, the people we know and maybe remember in different ways. It also, though, had to be a place that helped people remember the enslaved woman on a plantation who got up every morning and fed her kids, and when she came back, she refused to let the field strip her of her humor, of her humanity. It had to remember the family that left Mississippi for the south side of Chicago in 1913. It had to remember people like my grandmother who came to Newark and scrubbed other people's floors and washed other people's laundry so that her children and grandchildren wouldn't have to. It had to be a place that forced America to confront its tortured racial past. There had to be moments that made you cry as you pondered the pain of slavery or segregation. But there also had to be moments where you found the joy, the resiliency that was in this community. You had to be able to tap your toes to Louis Armstrong or Duke Ellington or Aretha Franklin or somebody from the hip-hop world. I have no idea who it is. But it had to be a place that said, here, once and for all, you get to remember the rich history and culture of this community. But in all honesty, if it simply helped you remember, I'm not sure it should be a national museum. In some ways, the notion that was so important was to recenter the African American experience, to use, as Nancy said, the opportunity to take African American culture and use it as a lens to understand what it means to be an American. To say that this is not an ancillary story, but the quintessential American story. That this is not the story for people to say it's interesting, but rather this is the story that profoundly defines who we are as a people. And in many ways, when I think of core American values of optimism, resiliency, spirituality, when I think of the moments when liberty and freedom and citizenship was enlarged and made accessible, where better to look than within the African American community? So in some ways, the key is to say, this is your story, regardless of race, regardless of whether your family's been here 200 years or got here 20 minutes ago. This is your story. And in many ways, to think about then, how does this museum help us in other avenues of this vision? And one was recognizing that Americans don't do international well, right? We just don't. And the notion of saying this museum will help people understand not only the impact of the diaspora on the United States, but also help people understand the impact of African American culture globally. And that was really brought home to me in a very strange place. I was in Lapland, near the Arctic Circle. It has to do with fourth grade geography in Belleville. You just never overcome that. But I'm sitting under a reindeer tent with the village elder, and the translator says the elder has two questions. First question is, are you an American? Easy answer. The second question was, do you know Al Green? Now, I'm in the middle of nowhere. Do you know Al Green? So of course I come back and I call Al Green. And he says, of course they know me, But the other part of this vision, it seems to me, that was to make this museum work, was to recognize that there is so much work that has been done in museums, on faculty around the country. So don't pretend that you are the ship and all else is the sea. And we realize that in many ways, the Smithsonian has this great opportunity. It is the place that can bring people, millions, to the museum, either online or actually. But the goal should be to then be a beacon, but then push people back to local museums, to local places. So if you look at the story of the migration from the South to the North, people should also be pushed to see, how does the Louisiana State Museum do that? How does the California African American Museum? How does the Detroit Museum of History do that? So the goal is to recognize that this museum has to make other museums, other sites better by its action. But in some ways, if you said to me, what's the challenge of building a national museum? I guess the best way to begin is, I began with a staff of 2. We had no idea where the museum would be. Unlike any other museum in the world, we had no collections to start with. We had a dollar figure of millions and millions and millions of dollars to raise and not a penny in the bank. We had a few friends on the Hill and a lot of friends in the academy telling me what we should or should not do. But the reality is, we started from scratch. So I always tell people that at 8 o'clock in the morning, I have the best job in America. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, it's the dumbest thing I've ever done in my life. But because of the work of so many people, many in this room, I can now tell you that there are 165 people working to birth this museum. The museum has now from 0 objects to 35,000 objects collected in this museum. And we have maybe the coolest site in America next to the Washington Monument within the shadow of the White House with a building that is now 69.8% complete. Not that I'm really following it. But we've also, as an institution, raised $450 million. So that you'll all be able to come when President Obama cuts the ribbon in 18 months. But in some ways, it hasn't been easy. And the challenge of the building a National Museum have been really grand and really deep. In some ways, you begin with thinking just the challenge of conceptualization. What is this? You know, what is a National Museum in the 21st century? What's the role of technology? Even more basic, what does national mean in a transnational age? What's the role of Africa in an African American museum? How do you find the right tension between tragedy and triumph, between victimization and resiliency? How do you do what Langston Hughes summed up so brilliantly in a poem that he said, "Life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It is full of tacks and rips and uneven steps." How do you create a history that has those uneven steps, those rips and tacks, but still recognizes the resiliency of a community? How do you craft a museum that really helps America wrestle with issues of race and reconciliation? How do you craft a museum whose job is not to have a great building, not to have great collections, not to have good exhibitions, whose job it is to make America better? How do you do that? How do you, even in a practical sense, thanks to so much brilliant scholarship, there's so much out there, how do you figure out in a place that may have 6 or 7 or 8 exhibitions, what are the stories you tell? Do you tell the story of slavery and freedom? Do you tell the story of the Civil Rights movement? Do you tell the story of segregation? What about migration? What about work? What about sport? What about music? I asked for 4 buildings, but I guess I'll just get 1. But the reality is the challenge of figuring out how do you make all of that work? And for us, the answer was really finding the right tension. We spent 2 years interviewing people all around the world about African American history and culture. What do you know? What do you want to know? What don't you want to know? And we married all that data with the best scholars. One of the things that has helped this move so well has been the generosity of scholars from all over the world coming to help us wrestle with the stories we should tell. So in some ways, that challenge of conceptualization has been really at the heart of the struggle to create this museum. But what frames it even more is the challenge of racializing America's memory. Because think about it, America's ability to remember a more inclusive, a more complex and challenging past is in many ways hindered by the narration of American exceptionalism. Explaining how African American history forces America to grapple with and to question some of the core American values and myths. At the heart of American memory is the notion that the United States has always been a force for good. One of the reasons I'm so fascinated, people tell me, well, your job is easy because all you got to do is what the Holocaust Museum did. But one of the reasons for the success of the Holocaust Museum is the fact that those who perpetuated evil weren't Americans. In many ways, the difficulty arises when America confronts our own culpability, when it comes to the fact of the tragic history of American diversity. I mean, how does a nation that celebrates freedom and liberty as core values react when it realizes the limits and often hollowness of that freedom? How does a nation that views itself as a legal and military might, but also recognize that that legal and military right has not often protected the most vulnerable and the most diverse? So this museum must find a way to help America find a truer, more complex narrative that illuminates all the dark corners of the American experience, to help Americans realize that so much of its stated ideals were made real, were made visible, were made whole by the African American community. That is the challenge, it seems to me, of many 21st century institutions. I wish I could tell you that all the challenges of this museum were intellectual. But one of the great challenges was the ability to manage Congress. Now, I know that's an oxymoron, I got that. But the reality is that Congress is the Smithsonian and this museum's biggest donor. One of the first questions I always received was, can you tell, as John O. Franklin used to always remind us, can you tell the unvarnished truth in a museum that's partially paid for by the federal government? And the reality is yes, if you're political and strategic. And so part of what we had to do was figure out, how do we work with Congress? Early in my tenure, they asked me to go meet all the members of Congress that are part of the appropriators, give you money. So they told me that there was going to be one, though, that wasn't going to want to meet with you, wasn't going to like you, or wasn't going to be very friendly. And so I was prepared to meet this member of Congress, but the night before I was to meet him, I ran into him at an event at the Library of Congress. Turned out he was from North Carolina, my mother's from North Carolina, so I played every card I could. Seemed like a pretty good conversation. So I think it can't be that bad. The next morning I walk into his office, and it's got one of those offices where his desk is up here and your chair is down here, and he's got 15 people standing along the wall of his staff and me. So I start to say, it's good to see you, Congressman. He cuts me off and he says, listen, I don't like what you're doing. I don't think there should be an African American museum. I think in all candor, it should be a website. I'll give you $25,000, make it a website, then go away. Now I'm trying to figure out what to say, and he's going on and on and on. When he finally pauses, I remembered that when I worked at the Museum of American History, I was struck by how people were moved by the authentic, by seeing the Star-Spangled Banner or the Greensboro lunch counter. So I said to him, there's something powerful about the real. And I mentioned the Greensboro lunch counter that I had collected years ago. Suddenly this guy starts turning red, and he starts shaking in his chair, and he's holding his throat. And I'm thinking, Christ, he's having a heart attack. I could see the headline now, Bunch kills member of Congress. His staff rushes me out. The guy comes out about 20 minutes later, and he's crying. And he said, you helped me remember that during the Greensboro sit-ins in 1960, I was a student at Wake Forest, and I raised money to bail people out of jail. He put his arm around me, he said, I like you. I'm not going to give you any money, but I like you. But in some ways, what we really learned is that to manage Congress meant really that you needed to have 30 angels. You needed 30 people who would stand up from both sides of the aisle and say that what you were doing was good. Because you don't need to win in Congress. All you need is a tie. And so in ways, one of the things we did was immediately build that 30 angels. It didn't hurt that one of the angels was some state senator from Illinois who became a senator and then got a job in a big house. So that didn't hurt. But in some ways, one of the challenges is not just managing Congress, but really dealing with the expectations of the public, because there's such conflicting views of what this museum should be. In some ways, I'm always struck by a letter I received a couple years ago. The letter began, "Dear left-wing historian." Now, I knew it wasn't a fan letter, but the letter was very serious. It said, what happened to the Smithsonian I loved? It used to be a place that celebrated America, that talked about America's triumph. And now you're going to tell stories that are better left unsaid. And then he said a line that I thought was so powerful and so important. He said, after all, don't you know that America's greatest strength is its ability to forget. He then goes on to talk about how you should definitely not build this museum, that historians like me should never work at the Smithsonian. But I was thrown off because he signed the letter, "Best wishes for your continued success." But the notion of public expectations and public realization of what they want has been a real challenge. I think of the fact that a couple of years ago I was walking down the street and this elderly African-American woman just stops me and she hugs me. And she says, "I'm so proud of the museum." But then she said to me, "But please don't talk about slavery in the museum." In many ways, there are these interesting moments. I get a lot of letters saying, "Please make this museum a place that will inspire the next generation. Try not to talk about those moments of evil." Then I get letters and calls from people who say, "This has got to be the Holocaust Museum. Make this the museum that says this is what they did to us." Then I get other people who say that the museum really needs to be a place that inspires and motivates. And for me, that really means that what we've got to do is find the right tensions between these differing points of view, to recognize that the museum will tell those difficult stories, but it will also rise up those that have changed and challenged America. But it seems to me that the kind of personal engagement with this museum is both one of its great strengths, but one of its biggest challenges. For me, when I think about the challenge for me more than anything else was not about raising money. It was really, could we find the collections? Because in some ways, even if you create a museum on the mall that's ripe with technology, it's going to fail. Because at the Smithsonian, you're there to see the Greensboro lunch counter, the Wright flyer, the ruby slippers. You have to have that kind of material. So early on, Congress asked me to come and testify and say, and one of the questions was, can you find the stuff of history? So I lied and said, of course. But I had no idea. But I realized that maybe the way to do this was to recognize that all of the 20th century and most of the 19th century, and occasionally 18th century, is still in the basements, trunks, and attics in people's homes. So we created the notion of saying, that's the way to find these collections. So we created a program called Saving African American Treasures, where we go around the country and like Antique Roadshow, because I'll steal from anybody. You go around the country and you basically ask people to bring things out and you help them preserve grandma's old shawl or that 18th century photograph. And then what happens is people say, I want to give it to you. Well, we encourage them first to give it to local museums. But if it's, in the scholarly parlance, really cool, it's coming back to DC. And I've been struck by what that has done for us, the kinds of collections we found. Recently, because of this treasures, I got a call from a collector in Philadelphia who said to me, I've got material from Harriet Tubman. Now, as a 19th century historian, I knew there wasn't anything of Harriet Tubman around. But it was a trip to Philadelphia, and I could at least get a cheesesteak out of the deal, so I thought, why not go? I go into this library, and this man was a great collector, Charles Blockson. He pulls out this box, and he pulls out photographs of Harriet Tubman no one had ever seen. And then he's pulling out things that are just amazing. He pulls out this shawl that Harriet Tubman was wrapped in. There's a great picture of Harriet Tubman 3 days before she died, wrapped in this shawl. And then he pulls out a hymnal. Now, though Harriet Tubman could not read, it was a hymnal that had all those spirituals that we associate with her. Steal away Jesus, swing low, sweet chariot. Everybody's crying. And the guy said to me, this needs to go to the Smithsonian. So for me, it's the generosity of people who bring these things. Or it's the woman who came one day and said, I've got some stuff to show you. My grandfather was a black soldier in World War I, and he's got some ribbons and some pictures. Do you want them? Well, she dumps them out on my desk, and it turns out her grandfather was a member of the Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th. And, they were the group that fought under French flag initially, and they were given the French version of the Medal of Honor, the Croix de Guerre. There on my desk was his Croix de Guerre from 1919. And you suddenly realize that there are stories we're going to tell. But then the one that stays with me more than any is a woman who came to a talk like this, and at the end of the talk, she said to me, I left Brandeis University before I graduated because I wanted to be in the South during the Civil Rights Movement. And I have something to give you. Turns out she was in Birmingham the day the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed. And in her bag was shards of glass from the stained glass windows of the 16th Street Baptist Church. So in many ways, my fear of not being able to find the stuff of history was definitely wrong. And that in many ways, we've been able to find the things that are going to motivate people, that are going to move people, that are going to allow us to tell that story. But in some ways, the notion of raising millions and millions of dollars was a big challenge. When I took this job, they said to me, you probably have to raise $500 million. So I called my mother, and she asked me, how much money do you have to raise? And I told her, and she said, that's more money than God can count. And I realized that, how do we raise that money? On the one hand, we're very fortunate. We put together one of the strongest boards ever. I've got Oprah Winfrey on the board, Colin Powell, the head of American Express, the head of Time Warner. I mean, but as you could imagine, they're also, they're gifted people and high maintenance. But the strategy to collect money was pretty simple. And it really came from something that Mayor Daley in Chicago said to me. When I was leaving Chicago, Mayor Daley called me into his office and asked, why was I leaving Chicago to go to a one-horse company town, Washington, D.C.? And why would I want to run a project? And I realized that was the key to fundraising. Not to make this a project, but to say the museum existed from the day we began. So we began to hire people to do exhibitions, to write books, to do websites, to actually have a product that we can demonstrate. And the reality has been, because of that, we've been able to raise so much money. And that we are now, as I said, 18 months away from opening the National Museum. But I guess, thank you. I guess the last and biggest challenge was really, how do you build a building? What is that? Maybe more than anything else, I was asked all for many years, what's the building going to look like? Is it going to look like Africa? I don't know what that even meant. But people began to say, what are you going to build on the mall? And for us, the challenge was to say what we wanted was a building that spoke of spirituality, resiliency, uplift, but even more importantly, I wanted a building. If you know the National Mall, most of the buildings are white marble. I wanted a darker building that said there has always been a dark presence in America, a presence that you often overlooked. And we decided that not only would we make that building, but the building would be cladded in a kind of, bronze corona that I'll show you in a minute. But the architects, we have gifted architects led by David Adjaye, a brilliant young British architect. But they said, well, we can't have solid bronze, so we got to put holes in it. I said, well, let's not just put holes in it. Why don't we take the idea of the kind of work that has been done by enslaved craftsmen who did those wonderful ironwork in Charleston and New Orleans and make that the entire building. So the entire building is framed by that. So that what we're also saying in this building is so much of African American history is hidden in plain sight. So let me show you a fly through of the building, and then I'll conclude. Not too long ago, a journalist asked me, why are you doing all this? Why does this matter? And I realized I had a lot of answers to that question, but the answer was really simple. The only superstition I have is whenever I get on an airplane, I get my shoes shined. So I know every shoe shine person in every airport in the country. And normally when I go into a community, I spend a couple days, I'm pretty visible. So I was flying back from Dallas, Texas, and I went to get my shoe shine. It was an elderly African-American man. He starts to shine my shoes. He looks up and he says, "Are you that museum guy from Washington?" I said, "Yes." He doesn't say anything else. He shines my shoes. I reach in my pocket, I give him $8. He said, "Keep it for the museum." Now I gotta be honest, it's a shoe shine guy. So I said, "Come on, here, take this money." And he said to me, "Don't be disrespectful. I'm not even sure what's in a museum, but it may be the only place where my grandchildren understand what I did to life and what life did to me." And so in many ways, the goal of the museum is to make sure people like that are remembered and whose stories are told and celebrated. But I also think of how can this museum be a gift to America? I'm always hearing this quotation from a man named Charles Holmes, who was an enslaved person, who was asked in 1939, does slavery still matter? And his answer is brilliant. He said, though the slavery question is settled, its impact is not. The question will be with us always. It is in our politics, it is in our courts, it is on our highways, it is in our manner, and it is in our thoughts, all the day, every day. For me, I realized what a gift we give America if we can create a museum that would help all Americans, all who visit, understand that they are touched, informed, and profoundly shaped by the African American experience, by African American history and culture, all the day, every day. Thank you very much.